Now we are entering into a very tricky and a very gravy area, which is strategic communication. And I am now, discussing crucial parts of the Routledge Handbook of Strategic Communication, very widely respected book in the academia and also for the professionals, edited by Dania Holzhausen and Angst Zarfas from Routledge. Introduction. See, why should we be interested in strategic communication? Strategic is a much contested, albeit neglected concept in communication studies. One of the reasons for this neglect is that strategic communication may be associated with persuasion in its most negative sense. However, others argue that strategic intent is inherent in all communication. From this perspective, strategic communication extends well beyond its practical application in various fields of practice. In particular, thinking about communication as situated at the center of society requires reflections on the frameworks of power and interests in which communication is enacted in all kinds of organizations. These include corporations, non-profit organizations, activist groups, political parties or movements, government organizations, and all other kinds of actors who form part of the patchwork of today's culture. This handbook explores the field of strategic communication from a multidisciplinary perspective. It provides insights into ongoing discussions that build an emerging body of knowledge. The journey started with the first edition on the International Journal of Strategic Communication. Now we are delving into the strategic communication. So, number one point is this: as the book says, the strategic is inherently negative in its connotation. Why should we use strategy for communication? Then communication becomes persuasive. It becomes, or it has a tinge of, immorality or lack of ethics. Because why should we want to persuade someone into our own interests? Something Machiavellian in the very word strategic communication. But if you ponder deeply, or you don't have to be that deep, you can yourself see that in ordinary life, the very ordinary communications are difficult to communicate, even with the people who are on the same level: parents and child, teacher, student. Even they cannot communicate clearly. Even friends, even intimate lovers, they have misunderstandings. Why can't we communicate, and why the other does not understand us as we are? And that's why communication becomes strategic. Opportunities and challenges of this research area, as well explained by Derina and Angsar Zarfas. Strategic communication is a term that has become quite popular in communication science education in the second decade of the 21st century. Originally only used for a niche, that is, communication programs in the domain of national governments and the military, it is now increasingly popular as an umbrella concept embracing various goal directed communication activities, usually covered by public relations, marketing, and financial communications, health communications, public diplomacy, campaigning, and so forth. In the United States, many universities have merged formally distinct public relations and advertising programs into strategic communication formula. We can see in Europe, strategic communication is often used for managerial approach to the all fields of integrated communication for all kinds of organizations. Also in Asia and Australia. Now we will see that how this concept evolved since the publication of the article defining strategic communication in the inaugural issue of International Journal of Strategic Communication. The definition has been used to explore, limit, argue, debate, and study strategic communication. The anxiety is unnecessary because the study of strategic communication has never been intended to replace other areas of practice. Now, there can be four reasons why the study of strategic communication can be necessary and prudent, are provided in the 2007 article. Number one, problems in differentiating between traditional communication activities. the changes in technology that makes it increasingly difficult to differentiate between different forms of communication. Number three, that increase in methods organizations use to communicate directly to stakeholders. And number four, the fact that purposeful communication is the fundamental goal of communication by organization. So there is indeed a great deal of overlap between different domains of practice. So as we go along, we will understand that how they are different. And on the other hand, scholars of advertising, political, health and crisis communication, public diplomacy, management communication, marketing, they have since 2007 made important contributions to researchers' understanding of strategic communication. Now we must remember that in an organizational scale, when we talk about strategic communication, the strategic communication need not happen as it often happens within the field of office or in the professional life. The professionals will have to speak with the lay people for the advances of business. The audiences have to be connected. So for that, they will have to, uniquely design themselves in the situationality, in the positionality of the context. So, because now we believe that language is not universal, language is born out of a context. So, that context should be the battleground. But moreover, the traditional model, as we have been following earlier, in the two ways, symmetrical and two-way asymmetrical communication in public relation literature, the interactive or ritualistic model of communication that has a foundation in symbolic interactionism and organizational communication, and that focuses on how messages and people themselves are shaped during the communication process. So that's a profound point, because the moment we start communicating, it is not one way, it can be two way, but there are two axes, one who speaks, the other who listens. But the moment one speaks and the moment the other listens, in that very moment both the units can evolve, can go through a change. The moment I speak, I change, I am changing, because I am a flow. So communication does not change only the audience, or may not be able to make certain influences that it had supposed to. So there can be effective communication, there can be ineffective communication, but in the process changes everything and everyone, including the person me, who right now am speaking to you. And as you listen to me, some changes are bound to happen inside you, or maybe I can fail to deliver exactly what I intended to deliver to you. But communication can include both the speaker and the listener and the situationality out of which language emerges. This foundation remains largely intact at this time, in the second decade or the third decade of the 21st century. So, how to define strategic communication? It is a practice of deliberate and purposive communication that a communication agent enacts in the public sphere on behalf of a communicative entity to reach said goals. So now we have to see what are the goals to achieve we are doing strategic communication. So if we take into account what scholar Holzwagen is saying, that communicative entities cover the full spectrum of economic and social sectors such as trade and industry, politics, non-profit and government agencies, activist groups, and even celebrities in the sports and entertainment industries. While strategic communicators indeed do a great deal of work outside of the public sphere, such as managing communication programs and communicating with internal stakeholders. The ultimate aim is to maintain a healthy reputation for the communicative entity in the public sphere. So, having said that, now we will delve into what we call the strategic communication and the public sphere. So, the notion of control of public dialogue has always been inherent in the debate on the role of strategic communication. Habermas, in particular, has been critical of the ability of those in power to hire powerful agents to communicate on their behalf and so influence and skew public debate. His work was largely influenced by the reality that at that time the media were crucial in shaping and instigating public discourse, with the assumption that the media were neutral in this role and thus open to influence by strategic communicators. Popular understanding of the public sphere has changed, particularly during the past decade, with the increasingly important role of the internet, which brought a radical expansion of the public sphere and a marginalization of the major public media. While Northaft and Bennettl argued the vital sphere can only exist in a solid and real society that surrounds it, they also contended that the dominant characteristic of the public sphere is that the communication sphere to a degree collapses structural constraints such as time, distance, technical limitations, and physical handicaps of the person, to mention a few. The public sphere is not a place of gathering as a Tingstead anymore. Neither is it a force field of media attention constituted by a limited amount of actors. It is a network of points of interest. Something, a brand, a swine flu, a politician, or any other topic is in the public sphere because communicators who are points in the network of communications communicate about it. So they argued that the public sphere is now controlled by the truthfulness of the statements issued in the public communication sphere as perceived by the public. If strategic communicators can argue that their communication is in the public interest and contributes to the well being of society, and if their arguments are accepted as such, they will make a contribution to the public sphere, even if they use their own communication platforms to do so. Nowadays, we all can have YouTube channels and we do communicate through our Facebook account with our Twitter handles, Twitter and X now, after it is purchased by Elon Musk, Instagram. So we do have our individual, our uh, spheres of communication. It need not be a collective one. Individually, we can contribute to the public sphere. But we have to be convinced that whatever we are communicating are for the good of the interest of the many. So, in an analysis of the contribution of Dewey, John Dewey, the educational philosopher, to the understanding of the public sphere, his book Self, 2010, he argued that Dewey, believed discourse in the public sphere already was action, which was preserved in the form of shared meaning. Thus, for Dewey, discourse was already action that shaped the public sphere and subsequently society. Similar to Bentel and Northaft, Self argued that the public became activists through participating in the public sphere. So we have active activists, so which eventually led to solving social society's problem. We have LGBTQ, female rights activists. We have now male rights activists. We have activism of all sorts just to improve the conditions of society at large. So they came spontaneously. And whereas in the past the consequences of public deliberation because of mediators only vaguely reflected the public debate, now the relation between public communication and public action seems to grow more and more ominous. So, what Dewey talks about is very interesting. If you have gone through the philosophy of John Dewey, which are essential and very important discourses in the field of education, that education should promote the action or learning to do, doing. Action was his way of education. We do not learn, then perform it in action. We do action, and in that process, empirically, from first hand experiences of doing things, we learn. So that was the proposition put forward by John Dewey. So if we apply that same thing in communication, that communication is not saying something, then it will be performed in action. It is an action itself that already influences society, public communication. So now we can see that public communication and public action, can you separate them? That separating boundaries are getting fuzzier day by day. So what sets the current public sphere apart from that of 20th century is that it is more participative rather than representative. Very important. We not only represent, we now directly participate in the process. There still are some major media who contribute to the public sphere, but contribute here is the key word rather than mediate. Yes, so does media contribute or do they mediate? There still are some major media who contribute to the public sphere, but contribute here is the key word rather than mediate. Whereas the media was the main force in presenting different viewpoints, representing society in the 20th century. Digital media now allows members of the public to directly participate in public debate without going through these mediated channels. Thus, the public sphere has become participative rather than representative. Now, everybody matters in what a communication sphere rather than a public sphere, because everyone is participative. So, everyone can influence the public sphere. So, now comes the debate, public versus private. So, now in order to understand what is the role of strategic communication in the public sphere, it is important to briefly review the difference between what is public, what is private, which also is called the good life. Why? Traditionally, the public sphere was viewed as the arena where the wealthy, aristocratic, and well connected were expected to make a contribution. Women, peasants, and tradespeople were typically excluded from the public sphere because they were viewed as second class citizens who did not have the necessary competency, education, background to make decisions for themselves. Thus, the public sphere belonged to a very select group of people. It was a place where equals met, that is, the free and the privileged. This perspective led to the well known quote that the personal is political, also often presented as the private is political. Although this scenario has now changed with a public sphere that is more accessible to a variety of voices than ever before, it nonetheless highlights the split between the public and the private, which also frames the role of strategic communication in the public sphere. Say if strategic communications are participants in the public sphere and the role of the public sphere is to solve society's problems, they have a responsibility to present debatable issues to the public sphere. If not, their works will be ridiculed. Individuals who wish to manipulate the public sphere to their own benefit without bringing ideas and arguments that contribute to the public debate will be rejected, as is the case in the United States, when Donald Trump used his own brand to make unfounded political statements about President Barack Obama's birthplace. Trump has no elected status and has never run for office, and the way he used his public profile to insert himself into a political debate was met with ridicule. Since that public humiliation, Trump has been quite absent in the public sphere. But this was an earlier example because now Trump has come to the for the second term in power as president in United States of America. But now this is an example of how arguments in the public sphere are rejected when they are not authentic or do not contribute to the improvement of society. If strategic communicators are participants in the public sphere and the role of the public sphere is to solve society's problems, they have a responsibility to present debatable issues to the public sphere. If not, their works will be ridiculed. Now, the inclusion of the public sphere in a definition of strategic communication is therefore valuable in debating the role of the practice. In addition to its many other attributes, the role of strategic communicators should surely include helping others gain access to the public sphere through good, thoughtful arguments that can advance the interests of the communicative entity while contributing to the improvement of society. That in itself already represents strategic action as per Dewey. Furthermore, many strategic communicators will attest to the notion that the pervasiveness of the public sphere make them more thoughtful about what and how they communicate about issues, even when they communicate in the marketing and branding context. The public sphere has become a corridor, and I quote Bentel and Northaft, a corridor that limits your maneuverable space when trying to make sense out of reality. Unquote. So, an important point you can notice is coming out that effective communication itself can be improvement of society in form of consciousness unfoldment of an individual. So that is, while technology facilitates public communication, there also are indicators that it might pose a future danger to that very important contribution through the process of datafication, which means putting phenomena in a quantified format so it can be tabulated and analyzed. Datafication is the process underlying the concept of big data and which allow people to collect vast quantities of data through the use of algorithms. Nowadays, we are using data and statistics for everything. But when it comes to the private and when it comes to intricacies of life, sometimes algorithm fails to capture the truth because every pros and cons can be defined by the same data set or the institution that invests financially for the for those economic and social algorithm models and data. Their authenticity comes into question because the mindset through which the data was collected, the process of collecting data, that itself is invested into some self-serving interest of one particular location of power. So when power is involved in the lens of research, then the data and the statistics comes into question and the truth remains unclear. So yes, anybody who has shopped online will know how the products and services searched beforehand keep propping up while one is using the internet. Yes, what people do not realize is the extent to which they offer up information willingly in the era of big data, simply because the nature of this kind of data is so different from what we generally perceive as data. So, datafication can be described by a scholar as the ability to take information about all things under the sun, including ones we never used to think of as information at all, such as a person's location, the vibrations of an engine, or the stress on a bridge, and transform it into a data format to make it quantified. Now we have to look at that this stratification of data, quantification of data can lead and also mislead. That aspect is much vaster, and I want this preliminary ideas of strategic communication that we discussed so far must sink deep into you, and from that point onwards we will continue this datafication, which is the trend of this 21st century, in a much detailed way. Strategic communication